Glad you're here. We're in Luke 24. Appreciate you being here this evening. Have visitors, we're glad you're here. If you're tuning in on the live stream, years after this, nothing happened in the 2 minutes before this happened. We're glad you are here. Glad we're able to sit together this evening to open up God's Word and to study from it. Appreciate David and the good songs that he has led for us that fit in with what we're going to talk about this evening. Luke 24 that JJ read for us just a few moments ago contains within it one of the stories after the resurrection of Jesus. And if you are keeping up with our weekly readings this year, Luke 24 is how we capped off this past week's reading. Jesus rises from the dead. We have, depending on the gospel writer that we're reading from, several different people that go to the tomb and find the tomb empty. But one of the interesting moments is after all of that has happened, you have two disciples who were walking to Emmaus. Verse 14 of Luke 24, they were conversing with each other about all of these things that had taken place. And it came about that while they were conversing and discussing, Jesus approached and began traveling with them. The two have now become three. But verse 16 tells us their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. What that means, I don't know, and I can't tell you. The text simply doesn't tell us. It's going to be like the mysterious thing that will happen a little while later when Jesus just poof and disappears from their eyes. Something happens here, whether Jesus was wearing a disguise, I don't know. Whether his head was wrapped, I don't know. But some way they don't recognize him as he begins this journey with them. And he asked them in verse 17, "What are you talking about?" And they stood still on their walk and they looked sad. And one of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things that have happened here these days?" You remember in conjunction with Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, what all had happened? Do you remember? The veil of the temple had been torn in two on a holiday when you had massive amounts of Jews in Jerusalem, so certainly that would have escaped the attention of absolutely nobody. Additionally, what else has happened in Jerusalem? We've had an earthquake, right, that coincides with Passover, which is unique in and of itself, but then add to it, what else happened during the... Well, we've got hours upon hours of darkness in the middle of the day. Oh, and we have the dead, some of the dead, rise, walk around the city for a little while. There has been a whole lot happening in Jerusalem. But these two disciples are sad for another reason, aren't they? Because with all of those things that had happened, what was supposed to happen 3 days after that? Jesus was supposed to rise from the dead. And the disciples are conflicted at this moment. Because they've gone to the tomb, and the tomb is empty, which is encouraging, but who have we not seen? We haven't seen Jesus. Did he really rise? Did someone just come and steal the body? Was his body even put in there? Where's Jesus? Which accounts for the sadness in these disciples' voice and in their countenance. And they talked to this unknown stranger about everything that had happened, about the Jesus that they were hoping to see. Verse 20. We were hoping that it was he who would redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is the third day since all these things happened. See, they remembered the promises, right? What did Jesus say back in John chapter 2? Destroy this temple, and in what? In 3 days I'll rebuild it. Little by little, the disciples understood something significant was supposed to happen on the third day. But they haven't seen it yet. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb, verse 24, and found it just exactly as the women also had said, but him they did not see. They were hoping to see Jesus, hoping to talk with him again, hoping to be in his presence, hoping to see the fulfillment of the promise of Jesus' resurrection. To this point, they haven't seen this. And shockingly, in verse 25, this visitor begins to upbraid them. "O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken, was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and with all of the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in the Scriptures. And as they approached the village where they were going, and he acted as though he would go farther, but they urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is getting toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." And he went to stay with them. And it came about when he had reclined at table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began to give it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. What a marvelously intriguing story. Jesus confronts two of his followers in hidden form, talks with them about everything that had gone on, everything that would go on, and how they should be viewing things. They sit down at table. They begin to share a meal. And after Jesus blesses the bread and breaks it, suddenly they put two and two together. They realize who's there. And then he's gone. We're calling this study tonight, Precious Memories, Broken Bread. Because it was at that moment that the disciples put the pieces together. Jesus has been raised from the dead here in Luke 24. It's going to be identified for us here in the text that Cleopas is one of these men who's walking on the road to Emmaus. We don't know the identity of the other person. There are two really main thoughts on who the second person might be. There's one thought that says that the second person is Mary. Mary is identified in John 19 as the wife of Clopas. If Clopas and Cleopas are the same person and one is a pet name or a corrupted name or a shortened form of the other, if that's the same person, this is possible, that this is one of the Marys who followed along in Jesus' ministry, who would have been the mother of one of the apostles. That's one possibility, who the second person is on the road to Emmaus. The other thought is that this second person on the road to Emmaus is Peter. Chapter 24 and verse 34 of Luke, when the two come to the 11 and state their case, they say that the Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon. If Simon Peter, if this is the appearance of Jesus that is being recorded, perhaps it is Simon Peter who is this second person with Cleopas on the road to Emmaus. Maybe it's somebody completely different and we have no clue. I like to think it's Peter, but I can't be dogmatic about that, and I can't tell you absolutely that's who it is, but it makes some sense in my mind. But from what we just read, Jesus encounters them in a hidden form. They're upset because they have not seen the risen Jesus yet, and the question is there, has he really even risen? But after he prays and breaks bread and begins to give it to them, they recognize who it is. They recognize that Jesus has risen from the dead and that he's alive still, and that everything that he had promised has come true. I want you to ask yourself this question tonight. What made the two disciples realize that they were with Jesus? What made the two disciples realize that they were with Jesus? I'm going to submit to you two or three ideas that I think feed into this, and they all kind of fit together synergistically. The first is they had some degree of confidence. The disciples, even the apostles, missed a lot of Jesus' teaching. Right? A lot of it goes over their head. A lot of it they're not putting together until after the fact. But they understand that something was supposed to happen on the third day. Jesus has used the imagery of the story of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea creature, 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. He's used the language of the temple back in John chapter 2, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. Over and over again, Jesus has emphasized to the disciples something significant was to happen on the third day. The women go to the tomb, followed by some of the apostles, and the tomb is empty. They have believed in Jesus. They are hoping in Jesus. They are confident as best they can that something was going to happen. And now here they are. And you can hear it in their voice, right, in the words that we read, that they were anticipating, they were hoping, they were longing to see Jesus. Not simply because they loved him, but because this is what he had said. That he had said, he had indicated he was going to rise again. But they haven't seen him yet. And the logical question simply is, if we haven't seen him yet, has he really raised? Is he really alive again? There seems to be some fear on the part of the disciples. When Jesus is going to find them, as other of the gospel writers explain, it seems almost that they are huddled off in a house by themselves. They've been sorrowful. Perhaps they're fearful of persecution. But they're hoping against hope that Jesus is going to do what he said he would do. You have the hope of faith with these two. Look at verse 21 again. We were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all of this, it is the third day since these things happened, and some of those who were with us went to the tomb. Why would they go to the tomb on the third day? You ever thought about that? Because they'd heard what Jesus said. It wasn't the apostles that went to the tomb first either, was it? Who was it? Do you remember? It was the women. They had listened to what Jesus said, they believed it, and they ran to the tomb hoping to see what they expected to happen would happen. So what made Cleopas and this other disciple realize that they were with Jesus? There was the hope of faith, that they expected something to happen, so they're looking for it. Let me submit to you another thing that happens that leads them to recognize they were with Jesus is not something Jesus did, but rather something that they did. Their warm hospitality provided the opportunity and the environment for them to see Jesus. Right? At what moment, do you remember the text that we just read in Luke 24? At what moment do they realize Jesus is with them? When he gives thanks for the food and distributes it them amongst them. That is the moment that they realize Jesus is with them. If they don't show this hospitality, if they don't invite Jesus in, does that opportunity ever present itself? And I'm not one to if and ands and what's going to happen if, but simply reading the text and seeing it as it lays before us, their hospitality opened the door for them to realize and see Jesus. Unexpected things can happen when we show hospitality. It's the message that the Hebrew writer would relate to us, right? Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for in doing so, some have even entertained angels, right? Folks will run with that passage today and perhaps make an application that's not there. I would submit to you just very briefly that passage in Hebrews that talks about entertaining angels. What's the name of the book? Hebrews. To whom is it written? Hebrew Christians. There's a notable story in the Old Testament scriptures about a man who unwittingly entertained angels in his home, isn't there? Abraham and the angels that came to visit him. Lot. We've got both of those stories, correct? I would suspect that's the application we're to draw there. But nonetheless, the ethic of hospitality is being commended to us all throughout Scripture, even here in this story in Luke 24. And then think about this. I want you to really think about this tonight. One of the things that made the disciples realize that they were with Jesus was their memories of Jesus. Memories are a powerful thing, aren't they? We talk sometimes about deja vu, right? The feeling that we've been in a place or a situation before and these things are familiar. Have you ever had that moment in your life that you're there somewhere and you feel like you have been there before, that this is all familiar, even though perhaps it's completely new? Here are the disciples seemingly in an environment in which they had never encountered Jesus before. But yet something happens, and it awakens memories in them, and they suddenly realize, this is Jesus we're with. Luke chapter 24 and verse 31 again. It is when Jesus reclined at table with them, took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them, that their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Their recognition of Jesus in this text is directly connected with Jesus taking the bread, blessing it, breaking it, and distributing it. Two things I want you to think about along those lines. Number one, we have account after account after account in our New Testaments of Jesus doing this very thing. Whether it was in the context of the institution of the Lord's Supper, as it is in Matthew 26, or whether it was in the context of a common meal, a recreational meal, right? A meal for the satisfaction of hunger. That's what we see in Matthew 14 and Matthew 15 with the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000. And it's the institution of the Lord's Supper in Matthew chapter 26. But in all of those instances, the text specifically tells us that Jesus did what? He took bread and he blessed it and he began to divide it amongst them. And the text would here tell us that it's at that moment that these disciples realized they were with Jesus. If we are correct that this is Cleopas and Peter, assumption I understand. But if we're correct, Peter would have been present at all of those occasions, the feeding of the 4,000, the feeding of the 5,000, and the institution of the Lord's Supper. So would have James, who was the son of Cleopas, the son of Alphaeus, same person. He would have been present at the feeding of the 4,000, feeding of the 5,000, the institution of the Lord's Supper. If that's who these two disciples are, time and again, they would have heard Jesus pray. They would have seen Jesus take bread, break that bread, and begin to share it. Do you have anyone in your mind that stands out for something unique in a spiritual way? It's kind of an opaque question, I know, but here's where we're going with this. I would get a feeling of deja vu if I were to, pardon me, I have my water, Daniel, so don't worry. If I were to hear a man get up and start praying and begin his prayer this way: God, our Father in heaven, holy and reverend is your name in all the earth. Because I would have to do a double take if I heard that today. There was a godly man that was there in Nacogdoches where I was doing a preacher training program named Billy Williams. Good old man. That is how Billy began every prayer I ever heard him pray. God, our Father in heaven, holy and reverend is your name in all the earth. If I heard someone begin a prayer like that, I'd have to do a double take. Because I know where Billy is. Billy is dead. And his body is in a grave. And I am earnestly anticipating that his spirit has gone to be with Jesus. But if I heard, I would have to go up and ask the person afterward, did you know Billy Williams? Right, because these are little things that begin to make connections for us, realizations we begin to make. Did you ever watch your mom or your grandmom cook something in the kitchen? And there's a particular way that she does it. My mom, when she makes eggs, I don't even know what to call it, if you call it over easy or over medium or whatever. I go to IHOP and I struggle to order them. It's not scrambled, and the yell is runny, I can tell you that. But everyone's mom makes eggs a little bit different, right? And my mom, she'll make them, and then she'll scoop a little bit of the oil or the butter, whatever she's using at the end, and put a little bit on the top of that egg just to finish it off on the top, all right? Everyone's mom or grandmom does something different in the kitchen like that, right? And you see that happen. Where'd you pick up on that? That takes me back to this place or that place. That seems to be what's happening with these two disciples here. Something happens, and it takes them back. Here's the practical part of our study tonight. What are you doing in your life? What am I doing in my life that after I'm gone is going to cause people to have those moments where they think back to me? And when they do think back to me, what are they going to remember? What are they going to see? Like I said, I will always remember Billy Williams' prayer life. I will always remember the way he began his prayers. I will also always remember Billy would slyly bring a visitor's card up with him when he prayed. You had to look very carefully to see it because he would keep it hidden in his hand. But then he would pull it out, and of course you know what was on the card, right? It was the name of every sick person in the congregation, and some even outside of the congregation that I'd never heard of, but Billy knew about them and he was going to pray for them. I will remember that as long as I have a rememberer that's functional. What are people going to remember about me? You know what I remember about my dad growing up at the dinner table until we were about in 6th grade? The same dinner time prayer. Anyone have a dad who does the same dinner time prayer? Right? To where everyone at the table can begin to quote it from memory. Some of you are smiling and some of your wives are smiling. That tells me that this is a common something that has happened before. And then along about 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, we notice that Dad's prayers change a little bit, right? And that we can't predict the next word and the next phrase like we used to could. And to this day, we can't. And some might critique and say, well, why are you saying the same prayer all along? Oh, okay. But now I'm seeing as a young person, there was a change in my father. And that my dad was constantly working on getting better with the Lord in his own walk, particularly in his prayer life. I saw growth in my father. What a great thing for a child to see, right? What are folks going to remember me for? Will they remember me for a sincere prayer life? What is it that awoke these two disciples to the fact that Jesus was there with them? They heard him pray, and it immediately took them back. Did it take him back to the upper room? If it's Peter, does it take him back to the feeding of the 4,000, to the feeding of the 5,000? Does it take him back to some of the private interactions he would have had with Jesus? Does it take him back to the garden where Jesus was praying some 72 hours earlier? Does it take him back to the Mount of Transfiguration? Does it take him back to any of those unnamed times when Jesus would pray? When people look back at my life, when people look back at your life, are they going to remember us for our sincere prayer lives? Look at Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, look at verse 5 with me. Matthew 6 and verse 5. When you pray, Jesus says, you are not to be as the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners in order to be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your inner room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. And when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetitions that the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. Jesus tells us our prayers don't have to be long to be acceptable. Some of you are thinking, yeah, Tyler, and your sermons don't have to be either. Verse 8, therefore, do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. And then Jesus begins here in verse 9 to teach His disciples how to pray. In other gospel accounts, what prompts Jesus teaching His disciples how to pray is the question, or the prompt, Lord, teach us to pray. Perhaps it's an indication to us that prayer doesn't always come easily and naturally. It is a skill that we work on. It's not that God gets better as a hearer. It's that we get better not only in our expression, but also in our faith, in the depth of our trust and confidence in God. What are our children going to remember in our prayer lives? Are our kids ever going to remember hearing us pray? Let me ask you that as a parent. Is your child going to remember hearing you pray? And if your child does not remember you praying right now, today's a wonderful day to start changing that. Our kids need to hear us pray. They need to learn how to pray by hearing us pray. And if this story in Luke 24 tells us anything, it tells us of the power of memory, power of moments of simplicity that at a later date can awaken us to see Jesus in some way in our own lives. Go back to Luke 24 and verse 30. It wasn't just the praying. It was when Jesus took bread and blessed it and broke it and began giving it to them. The text doesn't tell us that Jesus ate. He is going to eat later, even in His resurrected form. But the text here doesn't tell us that Jesus Himself ate. Rather, it tells us He did what? That He distributed to others. Some of you know that Audrey and I, in times past, have been fortunate enough to do some international hosting of orphaned children from Ukraine. I know it's one of the memories that sticks with me. I'm fairly confident Audrey can recite this memory to you from beginning to end like I can. We picked two of our kids up at the airport at DFW, Vlad and Sophia. And everybody's hungry. It's been a long day. Where are we going to take them? No, we're not going to Chick-fil-A. That is a good guess. We got to do something more American than Chick-fil-A. Hurts my heart to say that. So where do we go? We go to McDonald's, don't we? We go to McDonald's, and we're just getting something simple, right? Just going to get a little Coke, going to get some French fries, and let the kids just calm down because they have internationally traveled more than I even want to think about. We get there, and we're oohing and awing at the Coke machine, and we're oohing and awing at the ketchup dispenser because that's really cool. And then we sit down, and the first thing Vlad does is he makes sure his sister has some French fries, and he offers me and Audrey some of his before he then begins to eat his own. Little kid, doesn't know anything about the kind of life we live, offers it to us. I will remember that as long as I have a rememberer that's functional. The disciples remembered Jesus, not for His taking, but for His giving and His sharing. Is that how others are going to remember me? Notice how incredibly simple these concepts are. They remembered Jesus for His prayer. They remembered Jesus as a giver and a sharer. Wasn't even His food, was it? It was food that was offered to Him. But the first thing that He did after blessing it was return it back to them before He ate for Himself. I'm not saying there's specifically any pattern for us to follow in that. I'm not saying that if someone sets the Chick-fil-A before you, that you must first offer some back to them before you eat it. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that Jesus lays down an example here of giving and sharing, which is consistent with what he taught. Interestingly, look at Acts chapter 20. Look at Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, and in verse 35, this is one of the anachronistic statements of Jesus. It is a statement that Jesus himself made, but it's not recorded for us in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It's recorded for us in the book of Acts long after Jesus has already died, been buried, raised, and ascended into heaven. But from those who were his followers on earth, who heard him speak day in and day out, who heard things that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not record, recite this to us in verse 35. In everything, Paul says, I showed you that by working hard in this manner you must help the weak. And remember the words of the Lord Jesus Christ, that he himself said what? It is more blessed to give than to receive. Here is Jesus in Luke 24 practicing what he preached at some earlier time in his life. How did the disciples make the connection that they were there with Jesus? They recognized his sharing. I wonder when we're dead and gone, what stories people might share about us, what stories people might tell about us, and what might pop in their memories about us. I've told you the story of the funeral of one of our elders back in East Texas, and how we are there in the funeral home and we're seeing people come through and greet the family, and there are a couple of people coming in that neither the family nor I recognize. We're trying to, seeing these faces, and who is this? And we're asking aunts and uncles and cousins, does anyone know who this is? And here's one guy who comes in like a Dickies suit, right? Like you would wear if you're working out in your yard, or if you're over 80, what you're going to wear every day of your life, apparently, right? I hope that doesn't get me in trouble with anybody. And he comes up and introduces himself. And he said a name, and we put it together. He's the guy that owns a wrecker service there in Longview. He was a guy who was trying to start a business. No one would back him. And he came to this elder and asked. The elder backed him. And that guy had a job and had a business and was providing for his family and helping the community, all because years and years and years and years ago, one guy took a chance on him. One guy shared with him. What little things are we doing in our lives to share, to give, that are going to encourage others years down the road, that are going to cause others to remember that, and not only think fondly of me, but more importantly, make them think about Jesus? I need to make sure I'm doing what Jesus said, living by his words. It's better to give than to receive. Go back to Luke 24. Luke 24, this time look at verse 32. Luke 24:32. In verse 31, they recognize who Jesus is. I would love to see this. Poof, Jesus is gone. Vanishes from their sight. What that must have looked like, how slack-jawed they must have been when that happened. What an amazing thing that would have been to see. And they were saying to one another in verse 32, were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us? They arose that very hour, returned to Jerusalem, found gathered together the 11 and those who were with them, saying, the Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon. And they began to relate their experiences on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking bread. Their hearts burned within them when? When they heard him talking to them on the road. Look back to verse 25. This is what Jesus was saying to them on the road. O foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have heard or have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in the Scriptures. The disciples knew Jesus as somebody who loved the Word of God and who took opportunities to discuss it. Can you think of that person in your life? Who's the person in your life who you can think of right now as anytime you were around them, there was always a Bible question or a topic of conversation? Can you think of that person in your life who had that active love for God's Word? And who thinking of them brings what to your mind? The importance of what God's Word should be in your life, just like it was important in their lives, right? He's still alive, and I'm glad for that. I remember Carl Reeves, one of the first two elders I ever lived under. But a man who, anytime you were around him, could speak with the homespun wisdom that only somebody from backwoods Arkansas could, and could draw a connection between the most mundane happenings in life and how that applies to how we ought to walk and follow Jesus. And I'm sure you have somebody like that in your life, maybe multiple people in your life like that. But what kind of memories are we leaving for those who are going to come after us? We've been the beneficiary of those people. What greater way can we give and share, like we just talked about, than by becoming that kind of person in our own lives, to where when we're interacting with those around us, spiritual conversation flows out of us organically. It's not something that's forced. It's not something that's inauthentic, but it is something that is a part of who we are because it is who I am and what I'm about. Their hearts burned. I read that and I begin to think, you know what? Jesus was hidden from them, but they're starting to make some connections right there, aren't they? They're hearing some things that are familiar. Maybe the way that he taught. Maybe the cadence in his voice. And then the pieces all come together when they hear him pray and break the bread and begin to distribute it. And suddenly everything comes together. This is Jesus. This is him. And he's gone. But oh, they saw it and they knew it. And it changed them. I wonder what change we might be able to make in our own lives and in the lives of others through having this love of God and his word, through giving and sharing, through having that sort of sincere prayer life. What are we doing in our lives to lay down memories that others will have of us that will most importantly point them to Jesus? Luke 24 and verse 34. They ran to the 11 and those who were gathered with them. And here's what they remembered and here's what they saw. The Lord has risen. What they had been anticipating, what they'd been hoping for, what they had been looking for, the one that they remembered. They saw him. It changed them. If this is Peter, we go from denying Jesus 3 times and weeping bitterly to becoming one of the most staunch advocates for Jesus and the gospel that this world has ever seen, beginning in Acts 1. What a monumental change to undergo. We're all going to leave something behind. There's that old expression, you never see a U-Haul pulled behind a hearse. We're going to leave behind all of our clothes. We're going to leave behind all of our money. We're going to leave behind all of our possessions. And those things are going to go to somebody else. Writer of Ecclesiastes talks about that and how unfair that is sometimes. But there's one thing that folks really can't take away from us even after death. And that's our memory. Not our own, but the memories of us and the lives of others. What are you doing? What am I doing to make sure that those memories are going to be memories that rather than push someone away from Jesus and the gospel are actually memories that are going to draw people closer to Jesus, to help people look for Jesus, to help people find Jesus. Let's live in that way. Let's live in that kind of way to where even the most mundane things in life, praying over a meal, serving the food and distributing it, can be a cause for somebody to see Jesus even after we're gone. Little things, seemingly insignificant things, but little things, lightly esteemed things that can change the world. If you look at your life this evening and you haven't been living for Jesus, that is where all of this begins. We've got to make the decision to follow Jesus. If you're not following him today, take up that cross. Deny yourself. Give your life over to Jesus. Be crucified with Christ in the waters of baptism, raised to walk a new life. Let him live in your heart through faith and guide you. If you look at your life as a Christian, you haven't been following Jesus like you should, but you want to make a change, and you're ready to make a change. We're ready to pray with you and to help you make those changes. If there's any way that we can help you in your spiritual walk this evening, would you let us know by coming while we stand and while we sing?